Rain pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, turning the city lights into long, trembling streaks. Emily Carter stood barefoot on the marble floor, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other still holding her phone. It vibrated once, then went silent. The message on the screen was short: "Stay in the bedroom. Do not come out." It was from her husband, Richard Hale. Emily stared at the words, confused, her heart already racing. She could hear voices outside the bedroom door, a woman's laugh, low, familiar, too familiar. Glasses clinked. Music played softly, something jazzy and expensive, the kind Richard liked to put on when he wanted to impress someone. She took a step toward the door. Before she could reach the handle, the lock clicked from the outside. Emily froze. "Richard," she called, knocking once, then again, harder. "What's going on?" No answer. Her stomach tightened, not from the baby this time, but from fear. The voices outside grew clearer, a woman speaking his name like it belonged to her. Richard laughing, relaxed, careless, nothing like the cold man he had been at dinner an hour earlier. Emily slid down against the door, her back pressed to the wood. The baby kicked sharply, and she gasped, gripping her belly. She had been feeling unwell all day. Dizzy, tired. She had told Richard she needed rest. He had nodded, distracted, already elsewhere. Outside that door was Vanessa Moore, his ex. The woman he had sworn was ancient history, the woman he said she would never have to worry about. Emily reached for her phone again and typed with shaking fingers. "I don't feel well. Please open the door." The message showed as delivered. No reply. Instead, she heard footsteps moving away, the sound of a bedroom door opening, then closing. Something inside Emily cracked, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, painfully, like ice breaking under silent pressure. She realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Her husband had chosen to lock his pregnant wife out of his life for the night. And in that moment, Emily didn't know it yet, but the name she would give her child, not his father's name, was already taking shape in her mind. Because once a man tells you to stay out, some doors never open again. Before she became the woman locked behind a bedroom door, Emily Carter was someone who believed that love was something you earned by being quiet, patient, and useful. She grew up in a small town in Ohio, moving between relatives and temporary homes after her mother passed away when Emily was 14. She learned early not to ask for too much. If you didn't complain, people stayed longer. If you were grateful, you were allowed to remain. That lesson followed her into adulthood like a shadow she never quite shook. When Emily met Richard Hale in New York, he felt like the opposite of instability. He was confident, polished, admired, a man who knew where he was going and expected others to follow. He noticed her in a crowded charity event, holding a glass of water instead of champagne, listening more than speaking. He called her grounded. He said she made him feel calm. No one had ever said that to her before. Richard courted her carefully at first. Dinners overlooking the city, long conversations about the future, promises wrapped in certainty. He told her she wouldn't have to struggle anymore, that with him, she would finally be safe. Emily believed him. She left her modest job in operations after they married, not because Richard demanded it outright, but because he kept saying, "You don't need that stress anymore. Let me handle things." And slowly, without realizing it, Emily's world grew smaller. Fewer friends, fewer opinions, fewer places she went alone. When she became pregnant, Emily thought things would change. She imagined Richard softening, becoming gentler, more present. Instead, he became distant, preoccupied, always on his phone, always in meetings. She told herself it was temporary. Big companies came with big pressure. Good wives were supportive. Good wives waited. But pregnancy was harder than she expected. The nausea, the dizziness, the constant worry that something might go wrong. She would sit alone in their penthouse during the day, one hand on her stomach, the other scrolling through baby names, wondering if her child would feel loved in a house that already felt cold. She tried to talk to Richard. He listened with half his attention, nodding while typing on his phone. Sometimes he sighed, as if her fears were inconveniences he didn't have time for. "You're overthinking," he told her more than once. "You have everything. Relax." Emily learned to swallow her words. She learned to smile when she felt small. She learned to apologize for being emotional, even when she was scared. By the time Vanessa's name started appearing more often casually mentioned, lightly dismissed, Emily had already been trained not to push. Richard said Vanessa was just helping with branding issues. Old history, nothing more. Emily wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than facing the truth. That night, behind the locked door, Emily finally understood something she had spent her whole life avoiding. Love that requires you to disappear is not love. And the baby growing inside her deserved more than a mother who stayed silent to survive. As Emily pressed her hand against her belly, tears slipping quietly down her face, a new instinct rose stronger than fear. If no one else would protect this child, she would. Even if it meant losing everything she thought she had. To the outside world, Richard Hale was a success story people loved to repeat. He built his company from nothing, or so the articles said. A sharp mind, a disciplined leader. A visionary CEO who believed in innovation, efficiency, and family values. His face appeared on business podcasts. His quotes were shared on LinkedIn. Investors trusted him. Employees respected him. Richard knew exactly how to perform the role. Every morning, he stood in front of the mirror in his custom-tailored suit, adjusting his tie with calm precision. He liked control. He liked order. He liked knowing that every version of himself had a place, and every place had rules. At the office, he was charming but distant, generous but firm. A man who spoke about balance while working everyone past midnight. He praised loyalty yet expected silence. He rewarded obedience and punished inconvenience. And lately, Emily had begun to feel inconvenient. Pregnancy made her slower, more emotional, less predictable. Richard didn't see it as vulnerability. He saw it as inefficiency, something that disrupted the smooth rhythm of his life. He never said it directly, of course. Richard was careful with words. He preferred implication. A sigh when she asked for attention. A glance at his watch when she talked too long. A reminder that right now isn't a good time, if you want and all. In his mind, he was still a good husband. He paid the bills. He gave her a beautiful home. He never raised his voice. He told himself that was enough. Vanessa Moore understood him in a way Emily no longer did. Vanessa never asked for reassurance. She never cried. She never slowed him down with feelings. She spoke his language, timelines, optics, strategy. She laughed at his jokes and admired his ambition without questioning the cost. When Vanessa re-entered his life professionally, Richard told himself it was harmless, convenient, even. She knew the company. She knew him. She made things easier. That was the lie he repeated. What he didn't tell himself was how much he enjoyed being seen as powerful again. How Vanessa looked at him like he was still the center of everything. How, with her, he didn't have to explain or soften or pretend to care. The night he locked Emily out of the bedroom, Richard didn't feel like a villain. He felt justified. He told himself Emily was overreacting, that she would calm down, that one night didn't matter, that she should understand how important this meeting with Vanessa was. He framed it as necessity, not cruelty. "Stay out," he texted her, annoyed she even tried to interrupt. In his mind, that door wasn't a boundary. It was a solution. What Richard didn't realize was that power only works when the other person still believes in you. And belief, once broken, doesn't come back quietly. While he poured wine for Vanessa and spoke about future plans, he assumed Emily would still be there in the morning. Apologetic, grateful, ready to forget. Richard had always believed people stayed because they needed him. He never considered what would happen when someone finally realized they didn't. And as he laughed that night, confident and careless, the version of himself the world admired was already beginning to collapse. One choice, one locked door, one silent woman at a time. Vanessa Moore did not walk back into Richard Hale's life by accident. She had always known how to time things. Years ago, when Richard first left her to marry Emily, Vanessa told everyone she was fine. She smiled at industry events. She congratulated him publicly. She moved on, at least on the surface. But privately, she watched. She followed the company's rise, his interviews, his carefully curated image as a devoted husband and future father. Vanessa understood one thing better than most people. Men like Richard never truly let go of the past. They only store it, waiting for the right moment to reopen the door. When Richard reached out to her again, it wasn't framed as anything personal. He said the company needed help with branding during a sensitive transition. He said he trusted her judgment. He said it would be strictly professional. Vanessa agreed immediately. She showed up calm, elegant, and prepared. She didn't talk about feelings. She talked about optics, about public perception, about how pregnancy could be a complicated narrative during a company's growth phase. She said all the right things without ever sounding cruel. And slowly, she reminded Richard of who he used to be before Emily. Vanessa noticed everything Emily missed. The tension in Richard's shoulders, the way his patience wore thin when he talked about home, the irritation behind his polite tone when Emily called during meetings. Vanessa never judged, she just listened. She also knew how to position herself. She never criticized Emily directly. She never crossed obvious lines at first. She simply implied that Richard was carrying too much, that he was being misunderstood, that his life had become smaller when it should have been expanding. "You deserve peace," she once told him, her voice steady, her eyes soft. "Not guilt." That sentence stayed with him. By the time Vanessa started coming over to the penthouse, she already felt familiar there. She knew which glasses Richard preferred, which music he liked after a long day, which version of himself he wanted to be seen as. She also knew Emily was pregnant, and she didn't care. Vanessa saw pregnancy not as something sacred, but as leverage, a weakness, a complication that made Emily easier to push aside. She told herself she wasn't breaking a family. She was reclaiming something that had always been hers. The night she arrived at the penthouse, Vanessa wore confidence like armor. She stepped inside as if she belonged there, glancing around the space with a practiced calm. When she heard the bedroom door close, she didn't ask questions. She already knew. Later, when she and Richard sat together with wine in hand, she noticed the tension in his face and smiled. "She'll understand," Vanessa said lightly. "You always choose what's best for you." Richard believed her. What Vanessa didn't see was Emily sitting on the other side of that door, realizing that the woman her husband had dismissed as nothing was very much something, something intentional, something dangerous. Vanessa thought she was winning a man. She didn't realize she was helping create an enemy who would no longer beg, explain, or wait. Because women like Emily don't explode in the moment. They go quiet. And when they finally move, it's never in the direction anyone expects. The first time Emily realized Richard no longer cared who saw her pain was the night of the gala. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, embossed and formal, announcing a fundraising event at the Plaza Hotel. Richard told her it was important. Investors would be there, board members, press. He said it would look good to appear as a united family before the baby arrived. Emily hesitated. Her feet were swollen. Her back ached constantly, but she nodded anyway. Saying no had never felt like an option. That evening, she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting a simple dress, trying to hide the exhaustion in her face. When they arrived, the ballroom glowed with soft lights and quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers, polished floors, smiles that never reached the eyes. At first, Richard stayed close. His hand rested lightly on her back as he greeted people, introducing her as his wife, the mother of his child. Emily tried to relax. She told herself she was imagining the distance between them. Then Vanessa arrived. She didn't walk in with Richard. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she appeared among a group of executives, confident and composed, dressed like she belonged exactly where she stood. When Richard saw her, something in his posture shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. Emily felt it. As the evening went on, Richard drifted away. Conversations pulled him farther and farther from her side. Each time Emily tried to follow, someone else intercepted him. Vanessa always seemed to be nearby, laughing softly, leaning in when she spoke. Emily stood alone near a table, her hand resting protectively over her belly. People glanced at her, then away. A few whispered. She caught fragments of conversation. "She looks tired. Pregnancy suits some women better than others. Richard's under a lot of pressure right now." The words landed like small cuts, not enough to bleed, but enough to hurt. When Emily finally found Richard again, she touched his arm gently. "I don't feel well," she said quietly. "Can we go home soon?" He barely looked at her. "Not now," he replied, his voice tight. "I'm in the middle of something." Emily followed his gaze. Vanessa was watching them. The realization hit her all at once. This wasn't neglect, it was dismissal. public and deliberate. Emily stepped back, her throat tightening. She walked toward the restroom, passing mirrors that reflected a woman she barely recognized. Inside, she locked herself into a stall and pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing. She whispered apologies to the baby inside her. For the noise, for the stress, for choosing the wrong man. When she returned to the ballroom, Richard was gone. Someone told her he had stepped out onto the terrace with Vanessa to discuss something urgent. Emily didn't confront him. She didn't scream. She simply left. As she stood outside waiting for a car, the city air cold against her skin, something settled inside her chest. Heavy, permanent. If he could humiliate her here, in front of everyone, he would do worse behind closed doors. This marriage wasn't cracking. It was already broken. And Emily was the only one brave enough to finally see it. The penthouse felt different after the gala. Quieter, colder, like a place that had already decided it no longer wanted her. Emily kicked off her shoes near the door and stood still for a moment, listening. No music. No voices. Just the low hum of the city outside the windows. She told herself Richard might already be asleep. That maybe tonight they would talk. That maybe he would apologize. She was still holding on to hope when the elevator chimed again. Richard stepped out, his coat draped over his arm, his expression distant. Behind him, Vanessa followed without hesitation. Emily's heart dropped. Richard didn't introduce them. He didn't explain. He didn't even look surprised to see Emily standing there. "We need to talk," Emily said, her voice unsteady but firm. "Now." Richard exhaled sharply, like she had inconvenienced him. "This isn't a good time." "Everyone." Vanessa glanced at Emily, her expression calm, almost sympathetic. Almost. "I'll be quick," Emily insisted. "I don't feel well. The baby." "That's enough," Richard interrupted. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous in its restraint. "Go to the bedroom." Emily stared at him. "Excuse me?" "I said go to the bedroom," he repeated. "Stay there." Vanessa looked away, pretending not to listen, though every muscle in her body was alert. Emily felt her chest tighten. "You brought her here," she said. "Into our home." Richard's jaw clenched. "Don't do this." "Do what?" Emily asked. "Tell the truth?" That was when Richard pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. Emily's phone buzzed in her hand. "Stay in the bedroom. Do not come out." The message felt unreal, like a line from a bad movie. Before Emily could respond, Richard stepped forward and closed the bedroom door behind her. She heard the lock engage. Emily froze, staring at the door. Her mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. "Richard?" She knocked once. Then again. "Open the door." No response. Outside, voices resumed. Quieter now. Intimate, the sound of wine being poured. Vanessa's soft laugh. Emily slid down the door slowly, her breathing shallow. The baby kicked hard, sharp enough to make her gasp. Pain spread through her lower back, unfamiliar and frightening. She tried calling Richard. Straight to voicemail. She tried texting again. No reply. Minutes passed. Then more. Emily pressed her forehead to the door, tears blurring her vision. She felt small, trapped, disposable. This wasn't just betrayal. This was abandonment. At some point, the voices moved away. A door opened. Another closed. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Emily stayed there for a long time, long enough for fear to settle deep into her bones. Long enough to understand that the man she married was capable of anything if it served him. When she finally stood, her legs trembling, something inside her had changed. She packed a small bag quietly, just essentials, just enough to leave. Before walking out, she looked back at the bedroom door one last time. That door had separated her life into two parts. Before she knew who Richard really was, and after. Emily stepped into the elevator without looking back, her hand resting protectively on her belly. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she was never coming back. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Emily stood alone in the mirrored space, her reflection pale and unfamiliar. Her overnight bag sat at her feet, barely heavy enough to justify leaving everything else behind. Clothes, photos, a life she had tried to build. She held the railing with one hand, the other resting over her belly, breathing slowly as the numbers descended. She half expected Richard to stop her. the doors to open, his voice calling her name. An apology sharp with panic. None of that happened. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors slid open to polished stone floors and quiet luxury. The late hour had thinned the crowd. Only one security guard sat at the desk, his posture straight, his eyes lifting when he saw her. It was Marcus Reed. He had worked nights in the building for years. Emily had spoken to him only a handful of times, small, polite conversations, nothing more. But when his eyes met hers, something shifted. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you all right?" Emily opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Her throat tightened, and she shook her head instead. Marcus stood, already moving. "Do you need help?" She hesitated. Trust didn't come easily, but something in his tone, steady, respectful, made her nod. "I need a car," she said quietly, "and I can't go back upstairs." Marcus didn't ask why. He gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. I'll take care of it." As Emily lowered herself slowly, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had left without a plan, without money of her own, without knowing where she would sleep the next night. Fear crept in, sharp and cold. What if Richard came after her? What if he cut her off completely? What if she couldn't protect the baby on her own? Marcus returned with his phone in hand. "A car will be here in 5 minutes," he said. "Is there somewhere safe you're going?" Emily swallowed. "A friend's place. For now." It wasn't a lie, just unfinished. The silence stretched between them. Then Marcus spoke again, more gently. "I saw someone come up earlier tonight," he said. "A woman, with Mr. Hale." Emily closed her eyes. "I didn't think it was my place to say anything," Marcus continued. "But I want you to know, you're not imagining things." Her eyes burned. She nodded once, unable to speak. When the car arrived, Marcus walked her to the door himself. Before she got in, he stopped her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "If you ever need a record of tonight times, footage, anything, I can tell you how to request it properly." Emily looked at him, surprised. "You shouldn't have to disappear quietly," Marcus added. For the first time that night, she felt something loosen inside her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." And when never thanks, the car pulled away from the curb, the building shrinking behind her. Emily watched the penthouse tower fade into the city lights. She didn't feel strong. She felt terrified. But beneath the fear was something new, something steady. She had walked away with nothing but her dignity and her child. And somehow, that felt like the beginning, not the end. The apartment in Queens was nothing like the penthouse Emily had left behind. It was small, barely big enough for a bed, a couch, and a narrow kitchen where the refrigerator hummed too loudly at night. The windows faced an alley instead of the skyline. Sirens replaced the soft hush of filtered air. But the door locked from the inside, and no one else had a key. That mattered more than space. Emily stayed with her friend Lena, a nurse she had met years earlier through volunteer work. Lena didn't ask many questions when Emily showed up with a bag and swollen eyes. She made soup. She handed Emily clean towels. She let her sleep. In the quiet of that first night, reality settled in. Emily had no income, no access to the joint accounts. Her health insurance was under Richard's company plan. Every practical detail she had once ignored now stood in front of her like a wall. The next morning, she sat at the small kitchen table, staring at her phone. No new messages from Richard, no missed calls. The silence felt intentional, like a punishment. Her hand drifted to her belly. The baby was calm, as if unaware of how fragile their situation had become. "I'll figure it out," Emily whispered. "I promise." She started making calls. Clinics, legal aid offices, old contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Most conversations ended politely but firmly. Waiting lists, limited resources, complicated situations. Each rejection chipped away at her resolve. By the third day, the stress began to show physically. Dizziness, tightness in her chest, sharp aches she couldn't ignore. Lena insisted on taking her to get checked. The doctor was kind, but serious. "You need to reduce stress," she said. "You're at risk for early labor if this continues." Emily laughed bitterly at that. Reduce stress. As if it were a switch she could turn off. That afternoon, she sat alone on the couch, a borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She scrolled through her phone, stopping at an old photo of herself and Richard from years ago. They looked happy. Or maybe just hopeful. She deleted it. Instead, she opened a notes app and began writing things down. Dates, times, moments she remembered clearly. The gala, the night in the penthouse, the locked door. She didn't know why yet. She just knew she needed to remember everything exactly as it happened. That night, Lena placed a small box on the table. Inside were baby clothes she had saved from a cousin. Soft, neutral colors, practical. Emily picked up a tiny shirt and pressed it to her chest. Her eyes filled with tears, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming realization that someone cared without expecting anything back. Later, when the apartment was quiet, Emily made a decision. She would stop waiting for Richard to explain himself. She would stop hoping he might suddenly become the man she needed. If she was going to protect her child, she had to stop surviving day to day and start preparing for a fight she never wanted. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and exhaustion, a stronger thought took root. She didn't need to win against Richard. She just needed to make sure he could never hurt them again. By the end of the first week in Queens, Emily understood something she had avoided her entire life. Silence could be dangerous, but preparation was powerful. Richard still hadn't called. No apology, no explanation, no concern for the baby. Just an empty absence that felt deliberate, like he was waiting for her to panic, to crawl back, to admit she couldn't survive without him. Emily refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she began to organize her thoughts the way she once organized projects at work, calmly, carefully, without emotion getting in the way of facts. She opened her laptop one morning while Lena was at her shift and created a folder titled Timeline. Inside it, she started listing everything she could remember with precision. Dates, locations, who was present, what was said. She didn't embellish. She didn't guess. She wrote only what she knew was true. The gala at the plaza, Richard leaving her alone, the terrace, Vanessa, the penthouse, the text message, the locked door. Seeing it laid out that way made her hands shake. Not because she doubted herself, but because the pattern was suddenly impossible to ignore. This wasn't one bad night. It was a series of choices. Emily reached out to a legal aid organization that helped women dealing with marital abandonment. The intake coordinator listened quietly, then asked questions that made Emily uncomfortable in a way she hadn't expected. Did he restrict your access to money? Yes. Did he isolate you socially? I think so. And 4. Did he ever prevent you from leaving a room? Emily's breath caught. Yes. The woman on the phone paused. That matters, she said gently. That afternoon, Emily met with an attorney named Sarah Nguyen at a small office near the courthouse. Sarah didn't rush her. She didn't interrupt. She took notes with steady focus as Emily spoke. This isn't about revenge, Sarah said when Emily finished. This is about protection. Yours and the baby's. They talked about next steps, about documentation, about doing everything by the book. Sarah warned her that Richard would likely try to control the narrative first. Men with power usually do, she said. They rely on disbelief, on people assuming you're emotional or unstable. Emily nodded. She had already felt that fear creeping in. When she returned to the apartment, there was a message waiting on her phone. From Richard. Where are you? That was it. No concern. No remorse. Just a demand. Emily stared at the screen for a long time. Then she did something she never would have done before. She didn't reply. Instead, she forwarded the message to Sarah and added it to her folder. That night, Emily lay awake listening to the sounds of the city. Her life felt smaller than it used to, but clearer. For the first time, she wasn't trying to manage Richard's moods or anticipate his reactions. She was focused on one thing: keeping herself and her child safe. Richard thought silence would break her. He had no idea she was using it to build something he could no longer control. Richard Hale didn't like being ignored. By the second day, after his message went unanswered, irritation had turned into something sharper. Control had always been his language, and silence was the one thing he couldn't manage. He wasn't worried about Emily. He was worried about what her absence said about him. So he made his first move. Emily was sitting at the small kitchen table when Lena rushed in from work, her face tight with concern. Your insurance? Lena said, dropping her bag. It's been suspended. Emily felt the words before she fully understood them. What? I checked, Lena continued. Your coverage is tied to Richard's company. They flagged it this morning. Emily closed her eyes slowly. She had expected this, but the reality still landed hard. Doctor visits, prenatal care, the hospital, all of it suddenly uncertain. Her phone buzzed almost immediately after. Richard again. I assume you've noticed the insurance issue, the message read. We need to talk like adults. Emily stared at the screen, her hands cold. This was his pattern. Create a problem, offer himself as the solution. A few minutes later, another message came through. I don't want things to get ugly. Come home, and we'll sort everything out. Emily forwarded both messages to Sarah without responding. That afternoon, Richard escalated. He showed up. Emily heard the knock first, firm, deliberate, the kind that assumed compliance. Her heart raced, but she didn't open the door. Lena stood beside her, silent but steady. Emily, Richard called through the door. This is ridiculous. She didn't answer. You're embarrassing yourself, he continued. People are starting to ask questions. Emily pressed her hand to her belly, grounding herself. Richard sighed loudly. You don't have to do this the hard way. I've spoken to my lawyers. If you come back now, we can keep this private. There it was. Privacy. His favorite word. I can make sure you're taken care of, he added. Housing, medical, money. You just need to stop this behavior. Emily felt something rise in her chest, not fear, not sadness, but clarity. She stepped closer to the door. Leave, she said, her voice calm but firm. Any further contact should go through my attorney. There was a pause. Then Richard laughed softly. You think this is a game? You don't have resources. You don't have leverage. Emily said nothing. You're pregnant and emotional, he continued. Judges don't like instability. That was the threat. Lena opened the door just enough to speak. You've been asked to leave, she said. If you don't, I'm calling the police. Richard's expression shifted. Annoyance gave way to calculation. He took a step back, smoothing his jacket. This isn't over, he said quietly, looking past Lena at Emily. You can't win. He walked away. Emily sank into a chair as the door closed, her body trembling. The danger was real now. Richard wasn't trying to reconcile. He was trying to reclaim ownership. That evening, Sarah called. He's making mistakes, she said, big ones, and he doesn't realize it yet. Emily looked down at her belly, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering. Neither did I, she said, until now. And 4. The contractions started just after dawn. Emily had barely slept. The night before, she lay awake, listening to the radiator click and the city breathe outside the window, her mind replaying Richard's voice at the door. When the pain first came, low and steady, she told herself it was nothing. Stress, fatigue. Another false alarm. Then it came again. Stronger this time. Sharp enough to steal her breath. Emily sat up slowly, one hand gripping the edge of the couch, the other pressing against her belly. Fear rushed in immediately, fast and overwhelming. It was too early. She wasn't ready. Nothing was ready. Lena, she called, her voice shaking. Lena was on her feet in seconds. One look at Emily's face and she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys, her jacket, her phone. We're going now. The ride to the hospital felt unreal. Every bump in the road sent pain through Emily's body, each contraction closer together than the last. She focused on breathing, on staying calm, on not letting panic take over. At the hospital, the lights were too bright, the hallways too long. Nurses asked questions Emily struggled to answer. Name, date of birth, insurance. The word landed like a punch. There was an issue, Emily said quietly. Lena stepped in. We'll handle it. And it was? Emily was taken to a room, monitors strapped around her belly. A doctor came in, her expression serious but composed. You're in early labor, she said. We'll do everything we can, but you need to stay as calm as possible. Calm. Emily stared at the ceiling, tears sliding into her hair. She had imagined this moment so differently. Richard by her side, his hand in hers, a shared breath when the pain peaked. Instead, she was alone. Her phone buzzed on the small tray beside the bed. Richard, I heard you went to the hospital, the message read. Where are you exactly? Emily turned the phone face down. Minutes later, another message. You can't shut me out of this. She closed her eyes. Hours blurred together. Pain rose and fell like waves she barely survived. At some point, a new doctor entered the room, a woman with calm eyes and a steady voice. She introduced herself, asked Emily questions, explained procedures without rushing. You're doing well, she said gently. Stay with me. Those words mattered more than she expected. Between contractions, Emily thought about everything that had led her here. The locked door, the silence, the threats, and beneath it all, the life inside her that had trusted her completely. She made a decision then, as clear as anything she had ever known. This child would not grow up begging for love. As the hours passed, Emily felt herself crossing a line she could never step back over. Whatever happened next, courtrooms, arguments, consequences, she would face it as a mother who chose protection over fear. When the nurse finally said, "It's time," Emily cried, not from pain, but from the weight of the moment. Somewhere in the hospital, Richard was probably already on his way, furious about what he didn't control. He didn't know it yet, but this was the last moment he had any power at all. Emily heard her baby cry before she felt anything else. The sound was small, sharp, and real, cutting through the pain, the fear, the long hours that had blurred together. Someone placed the baby against her chest, warm and trembling, and Emily broke down completely. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped her arms around this tiny life she had fought so hard to protect. "It's a boy," the doctor said gently. Emily nodded, unable to speak. She pressed her lips to her son's forehead and whispered promises she didn't know how she would keep yet, only that she would try with everything she had. For a few precious minutes, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Then reality came back. A nurse approached with a clipboard. "We'll need to complete the birth registration," she said kindly. "Father's information and the baby's name. And port noter." Emily's heart pounded not from pain this time, but from the weight of the decision she had already made. At that moment, the door opened. Richard walked in. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his expression tight with irritation, masked as concern. He barely looked at Emily before his eyes went to the baby. "There you are," he said, as if she had simply wandered off. "I should have been informed sooner." Emily didn't respond. The nurse hesitated, sensing the tension. "Sir, are you the father?" "Yes," Richard answered immediately. "Of course I am." He stepped closer, looking down at the baby like he was inspecting something that belonged to him. "What did you name him?" Emily finally looked at him. Her voice was quiet, steady, and final. "His name is Noah." Richard nodded once. "Good." Then, impatiently, "And the last name?" The room seemed to hold its breath. "Noah Brooks," Emily said. The words landed like a blow. Richard stared at her, disbelief flashing across his face. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Emily replied. "That's not my name," he snapped. "No," she said calmly. "It isn't." Richard's voice rose. "This is my son. He will carry my name." Emily shifted slightly, holding Noah closer. "He will carry the name of the man who showed up, the man who protected us when we needed it." Richard laughed harshly. "This is insane. Who is Brooks? Some fantasy you've created?" Emily met his eyes without flinching. "He's the person who treated me like a human being when you treated me like an inconvenience." The nurse stepped in carefully. "Ma'am, are you sure about this?" "We can wait." "No," Emily said. "I'm sure." Richard turned red. "You don't get to do this," he said through clenched teeth. "You're emotional. You're confused." Emily shook her head. "I've never been clearer. Thanks for watching." Richard reached for the clipboard, but the nurse pulled it back. "Sir, please step away." "Hospital policy." "This is my child," Richard shouted. "And this is my body," Emily replied, her voice still calm. "My birth. My decision." Security was called quietly. The room filled with tension, as Richard realized he was losing control, piece by piece. As he was escorted out, he looked back at Emily with fury and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he said. Emily didn't answer. She looked down at Noah Brooks, sleeping peacefully against her chest, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Because for the first time, her child's name told the truth. Richard didn't wait long to strike back. By the next morning, Emily's phone was buzzing nonstop. Unknown numbers, missed calls, voicemails she didn't listen to. Messages that shifted tone with each attempt: anger, disbelief, forced calm, then thinly veiled threats. You've crossed a line. This makes you look unstable. You're letting strangers influence you. Emily kept the phone face down on the bedside table and focused on Noah's breathing instead. Slow, steady, real. Every time fear tried to rise, she reminded herself of that sound. But Richard wasn't finished. By noon, the narrative had already started to move without her. A nurse mentioned casually that someone from the father's legal team had called, asking questions about visitation. Another staff member asked if Emily felt safe making decisions alone. The implication hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Richard wasn't attacking her directly anymore. He was planting doubt. That afternoon, Sarah arrived at the hospital with a folder under her arm and a look that told Emily everything she needed to know. "He's telling people you're being manipulated," Sarah said quietly, "that you're emotionally compromised and acting out of spite." Emily laughed once, hollow. "Of course he is. He's also pushing for an emergency paternity filing," Sarah continued. "He wants to force the last name change before you're discharged." Emily's chest tightened. "Can he do that?" "Not easily," Sarah replied, "but he can make noise, enough to scare you." Emily looked down at Noah, her jaw setting. "It won't work." That evening, Vanessa made her move. Emily recognized the name immediately when it appeared on her screen. She almost didn't answer. Almost. "Emily," Vanessa said smoothly, as if they were old friends. "I'm so sorry, things have gotten so complicated." Emily said nothing. "I just wanted to say, this doesn't have to get ugly," Vanessa continued. "Richard is under enormous pressure. This situation, it's not good for anyone." "You mean it's not good for him?" Emily replied. Vanessa sighed softly. "You're tired, vulnerable. People might misunderstand your choices." Emily closed her eyes. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Vanessa said. "I'm advising you." "Then here's my advice," Emily said evenly. "Stop calling." Vanessa paused. "You're making a mistake." Emily ended the call. Minutes later, Sarah's phone lit up. Vanessa had contacted her too, offering a settlement, money, housing, a clean break, in exchange for one thing: change the name. Emily didn't hesitate. No. That night, Richard filed a motion claiming parental alienation and emotional instability. He requested a psychological evaluation, emergency custody review, everything designed to overwhelm and exhaust her. Classic pressure tactics. Emily read the documents with shaking hands, then passed them to Sarah. "Is this how it's going to be?" Emily asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "He's panicking." "Good," Emily said, "because I'm done being scared." She looked at her son, sleeping peacefully, despite the chaos gathering around them. Richard thought the name was an insult. Vanessa thought it was leverage. Neither of them understood the truth. The name wasn't an attack. It was a boundary. And for the first time, Emily was ready to defend it no matter how loud they screamed. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of Noah's breathing. Emily sat upright in bed, her back supported by pillows, watching the rise and fall of her son's tiny chest. Outside the window, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Taxis passed. Lights flickered on and off. Life continued, unaware that something permanent had shifted inside that small room. Sarah sat in the chair beside the bed, reviewing documents. She paused and looked up. "Before this goes any further," she said gently, "the court will ask why you chose that name. Not emotionally, legally. They'll want context." Emily nodded. She had expected this question. She had been answering it in her head for years. "Brooks isn't random," Emily said quietly. "It's not a statement, it's a history." Sarah closed the folder. "Tell me." Emily took a slow breath. "When I was 19, I was living out of my car," she began. "I'd just aged out of foster care. No family, no safety net. I took whatever work I could find and tried not to think about the future." She looked down at Noah, her voice steady but soft. "Daniel Brooks was a legal volunteer at a community clinic. I went there because I'd been wrongfully evicted. I was scared and embarrassed. I expected to be dismissed." She shook her head slightly. "He didn't rush me. He didn't talk down to me. He listened." Emily swallowed. "He helped me get back on my feet, found me resources, checked in even after his job was done, not because he had to, because he thought I mattered." Sarah listened without interrupting. When I met Richard years later, I thought love was supposed to feel powerful, Emily continued. Daniel showed me it was supposed to feel safe. I didn't understand the difference back then. She paused. But when Richard locked me out, when I realized my child and I didn't matter to him in the ways that counted, I knew whose name meant protection. Sarah nodded slowly. That's important. It's the truth, Emily said. I didn't choose the name to hurt Richard. I chose it to remind myself what care actually looks like. That afternoon, Daniel Brooks came to the hospital. He stood awkwardly near the door at first, clearly unsure if he belonged there. When Emily looked up and saw him, her eyes filled with tears. You didn't have to come, she said. I wanted to, Daniel replied. His voice was calm, grounded. The same voice she remembered from years ago. I heard you had the baby. Emily nodded. I did. She gestured to Noah. Daniel stepped closer, careful, respectful. He didn't reach out. He didn't assume. He's beautiful, he said quietly. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I gave him your name. Daniel froze. What? He asked. Not because of romance, Emily said quickly. Because when everything fell apart, you were the example I trusted, of kindness, of safety. Daniel's eyes softened. Emily, that's an honor I don't take lightly. I know, she said. That's why I did it. As Daniel left later that evening, Emily felt something settle into place. Richard would never understand that power isn't inherited. It's earned. And the name Noah Brooks wasn't about replacing a father. It was about choosing the right kind of one. Richard Hale stopped pretending the moment he realized fear no longer worked. 3 days after Emily was discharged from the hospital, legal papers arrived at Lena's apartment. Thick, official, cold. Richard wasn't asking anymore, he was demanding. Emergency custody review. Court-ordered paternity confirmation. A motion claiming Emily was deliberately trying to erase him from his child's life. He called it parental alienation. Emily sat at the small dining table as Sarah laid everything out, page by page. The language was sharp and strategic, designed to paint a very specific picture. An unstable woman acting out of emotional distress, influenced by outsiders, making irrational decisions. He's escalating, Sarah said calmly. This is no longer about the name. Emily already knew that. This is about control, she replied. Sarah nodded. And about punishing you for not backing down. The timing wasn't accidental. Richard had also filed a formal complaint with his company's HR department claiming Emily was harassing him through third parties. He had preemptively framed himself as the reasonable party, the concerned father, the professional man forced into conflict by an uncooperative spouse. Vanessa was busy behind the scenes. A mutual acquaintance warned Emily that Vanessa had been quietly suggesting Emily wasn't well. That postpartum emotions had made her unpredictable. That Richard was being patient under impossible circumstances. None of it was said publicly. That was the point. That night, Emily barely slept. Every sound from the hallway made her tense. She replayed Richard's words in her head. Judges don't like instability. He was trying to exhaust her, to make her doubt herself, to push her into a mistake. The next morning, Sarah brought a different folder. This, she said, tapping it, is where things change. Inside were records Sarah had formally requested. Building security logs, elevator access times, visitor sign-ins. Documentation from the night Emily left the penthouse. There's footage, Sarah said, not inside the apartment but enough to establish who entered, who stayed, and how long. It's never down. Emily's stomach tightened. Vanessa? Yes, Sarah replied. And Richard, together, late at night, while you were still legally residing there. Emily closed her eyes, steadying her breath. There's more, Sarah continued. Text records, the stay in the bedroom message, time-stamped, verified. Emily looked up. So, he can't deny it. No, Sarah said. And that changes how the court views everything. Especially your decision to leave. Everyone. For the first time since the papers arrived, Emily felt something other than dread. Momentum. Richard had assumed she would panic, that she would crumble under pressure, that she would trade truth for peace. He had underestimated her. That afternoon, Emily received one final message from him. You're making this worse than it needs to be. This will damage everyone involved. She read it once. Then she forwarded it to Sarah and put her phone down. Richard thought war meant noise. aggression, intimidation. Emily was learning something different. Real power didn't shout, it documented. And as the pieces came together, one thing became clear. Richard hadn't just crossed a moral line. He had left a trail. And for the first time, Emily wasn't running from it. She was walking straight toward it with evidence in her hands and her child safe behind her. The turning point didn't come with shouting or a courtroom confrontation. It came quietly, in a conference room that smelled like coffee and printer ink. Sarah laid the documents out one by one, her movements precise, deliberate. Emily sat across from her, Noah sleeping in a carrier against her chest. The room felt too ordinary for something that heavy, but maybe that was fitting. Truth rarely arrived with drama. It arrived with proof. "This is the security report from the building," Sarah said. "Certified copy." Emily leaned forward. Times, dates, keycard entries, elevator usage. Vanessa Moore signed in at 9:42 p.m. Richard Hale's private elevator activated at 9:44 p.m. No exit recorded for Vanessa until 6:18 a.m. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't feel shock. She felt confirmation. "There's more," Sarah continued. She slid over screenshots of messages. Richard's text, "Stay in the bedroom. Do not come out." Time-stamped. Verified by the carrier. No room for interpretation. "This matters because it establishes confinement," Sarah said. "You weren't just dismissed. You were restricted." Emily exhaled slowly. Then came the final piece. Marcus Reed. He had agreed to provide a sworn statement. In calm, professional language, Marcus detailed what he saw that night. Vanessa entering the building. Emily leaving alone hours later, visibly distressed, carrying a bag, pregnant and unaccompanied. He confirmed Emily did not return. No opinions, just facts. "This is strong," Sarah said. "Stronger than Richard realizes." Emily looked down at Noah. His tiny fingers curled and uncurled in his sleep, unaware of the war being fought around him. That afternoon, Sarah filed a response to Richard's motions. Attached were the logs, the messages, the sworn statement. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional, just truth. The reaction was immediate. Richard's legal team requested an extension. Then another. Their tone shifted from aggressive to cautious almost overnight. Vanessa stopped calling. By the end of the week, Richard sent a new message, longer this time, carefully worded. "I think we should de-escalate. For the baby's sake." Emily read it once and handed her phone to Sarah. "That's fear," Sarah said quietly, "not concern." Emily nodded. She could feel it too. The shift, the loss of control on his side. But Richard wasn't done. He tried one last angle. A private investigator showed up near Lena's building. Questions were asked. Neighbors noticed. The implication was clear. "We're watching." Sarah responded within hours. A cease and desist letter. Documentation of harassment. A reminder that intimidation would not be tolerated. That was when Richard finally understood. Emily wasn't isolated anymore. She had witnesses, records, legal protection, and she wasn't begging to be believed. She was proving it. That night, as Emily rocked Noah to sleep, a strange calm settled over her. For weeks, she had lived in survival mode, reacting, bracing, enduring. Now, for the first time, she felt ahead of the danger. Richard had built his life on the assumption that image mattered more than behavior. He was about to learn how wrong that was. Because once evidence exists, power changes hands. And the man who once locked her out of a room was now locked inside his own lies, while Emily stood on the outside, holding the truth, with nowhere left to run but forward. The courtroom was smaller than Emily expected. No grand speeches, no dramatic lighting, just wooden benches, neutral walls, and the quiet weight of consequences. Emily sat at the table beside Sarah, Noah asleep in his carrier against her chest. The steady rhythm of his breathing grounded her more than anything else ever had. Across the room, Richard sat with his attorneys. He looked composed, confident, like a man who still believed charm and reputation would carry him through. Vanessa wasn't there. That, Emily noticed immediately. When the judge entered, the room settled into silence. The hearing began with procedural language motions, filings, objections. Emily listened carefully, even when the words felt distant. She had learned not to tune out when men spoke about her life like it was an abstract problem. Then it was her turn. Sarah stood first, laying out the timeline calmly. She introduced the evidence without emotion. The security logs. The text message. Marcus Reed's sworn statement. Each item entered the record with a soft thud that echoed louder than any accusation. Richard's attorney objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Then the judge looked at Emily. "Mrs. Hale," she said evenly, "I'd like to hear from you." Emily stood slowly, careful not to wake Noah. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice didn't. She didn't dramatize. She didn't embellish. She told the truth. She described the gala. Being left alone. Asking to go home. The cold dismissal. She described the night in the penthouse. The text message. The locked door. The fear when she felt pain and realized no one was coming. "I didn't leave to punish him," Emily said. "I left because I wasn't safe." Richard stared straight ahead. Emily continued. "I chose my son's name because I needed to remind myself what safety looks like. I needed to give my child a name connected to care, not control." The judge watched her closely. "And do you believe the father poses a danger to the child?" she asked. Emily didn't hesitate. "I believe he puts his needs above others," repeatedly, "and I believe that's dangerous." The room was silent. When Richard's attorney cross-examined her, the questions were sharp but unfocused. They tried to paint her as emotional, overwhelmed, influenced by third parties. Emily answered calmly, clearly. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. When Richard was asked to speak, his tone was measured. He expressed concern, regret, frustration. He claimed misunderstandings, poor communication, stress. But when the judge asked why he hadn't unlocked the door, he hesitated. Just long enough. That pause mattered. After a brief recess, the judge returned. Her ruling was firm. Temporary sole physical custody to Emily. Supervised visitation only. No changes to the child's name pending further review. A warning regarding intimidation and misuse of legal processes. Richard's face drained of color. "This court does not take lightly attempts to control or silence," the judge said, "especially when a child is involved." Dation. Emily sat back down, her hands shaking not from fear, but release. Outside the courtroom, Richard didn't look at her. Sarah leaned in. "That was the moment," she whispered. "You were believed." Emily looked down at Noah, now awake, his eyes unfocused but calm. For the first time, she felt something close to peace. She hadn't won everything, but she had won the right to speak and be heard. And that changed everything. The court ruling didn't stay inside the courtroom. By the following week, the quiet cracks in Richard Hale's perfect image began to spread. It started internally. A closed-door meeting with the board, a request for clarification about recent legal distractions. Then another meeting, longer this time. Richard was asked to step out while discussions continued. That had never happened before. Vanessa noticed first. Her emails stopped getting immediate replies. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. People who once leaned in when she spoke now kept conversations brief, distant. The confidence she wore so easily began to slip. One afternoon, a compliance officer requested documentation related to outside consulting activities. Vanessa understood immediately what that meant. Someone had started pulling threads. At the same time, Richard's legal expenses mounted, motions denied, warnings issued. The judge's language control, intimidation, misuse, hadn't gone unnoticed by people who cared deeply about liability and public perception. Investors didn't like risk, and Richard had become one. When Vanessa confronted him, her voice was tight with panic. "You told me this would stay private." Richard rubbed his temples, his patience gone. "You said you knew how to manage optics." "I can't manage evidence," she snapped. "Or a judge. Thanks for watching." The alliance that once felt powerful now felt desperate. Then came the final blow. An internal audit flagged irregularities in Vanessa's consulting invoices, overlapping billing, undocumented expenses, services charged during hours she was physically logged into the penthouse building. It didn't look like a mistake. It looked like misuse of company funds. Vanessa was placed on immediate leave pending investigation. She called Emily that night. Emily almost didn't answer. "Almost. You think you've won," Vanessa said, her voice sharp but brittle. "But you've ruined lives." Emily listened calmly. "You made your choices. This was supposed to be temporary, Vanessa insisted. He promised. Emily interrupted softly. He promised himself, just like he always does. Silence followed. You used me, Vanessa said finally. Emily didn't respond, because that wasn't her responsibility anymore. 2 weeks later, Richard was formally asked to step down as CEO, pending resolution of personal legal matters. The press release was polite, corporate, carefully worded. But everyone understood. Power doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. Richard moved out of the penthouse quietly. No farewell, no announcement, just boxes loaded into a car at dawn. The building staff watched without comment. Marcus Reed saw it all. Emily didn't celebrate when she heard the news. She felt something better. Relief. Not because Richard suffered, but because he no longer had the reach he once did. Vanessa's name faded quickly from professional circles. Consultants don't survive long when trust evaporates. Emily returned to a routine that felt simple but real. Feedings, walks, paperwork, sleep when she could, healing where she needed to. One afternoon, Daniel Brooks stopped by with groceries and an easy smile. He didn't talk about court or consequences. He asked how she was feeling. He held Noah when her arms were tired. That kind of presence mattered. Richard had lost his title. Vanessa had lost her influence. But Emily had gained something neither of them ever understood. Freedom from fear. And in the quiet after the storm, as consequences settled where they belonged, Emily realized the truth of it all. Karma didn't arrive loudly. It arrived precisely. Life didn't suddenly become easy after Richard fell. It became honest. Emily learned that there was a difference. Weeks passed. Then months. The legal process slowed into something manageable. Scheduled visits, supervised handovers, paperwork that no longer felt like a threat. Richard complied because he had to. The man who once commanded rooms now followed instructions written in plain language. There were no more surprise motions, no late-night messages. His power had limits now, and everyone could see them. Emily moved into a modest apartment closer to the park. It wasn't large, but it was hers. Sunlight reached the living room every morning. Noah liked that spot best, lying on a blanket while Emily folded laundry or answered emails from the nonprofit she'd begun working with part-time. It wasn't glamorous work. It was real. Helping women navigate housing, benefits, and legal aid after leaving unsafe homes. Emily recognized the fear in their voices. The hesitation, the shame that didn't belong to them. She never told her full story. She didn't need to. "I understand" was enough. One afternoon, she received an official notice from the court. Final custody terms. Permanent recognition of the child's name. Clear boundaries. Clear consequences for violations. Emily sat quietly after reading it, Noah asleep against her shoulder. This was the end of something, and the beginning of something else. Richard requested one final meeting through attorneys, a mediated exchange to discuss logistics. Emily agreed, on one condition: Daniel would be present. Richard arrived thinner, older, the confidence gone, replaced by something cautious. He looked at Noah for a long moment, then away. "This didn't have to happen like this," he said finally. Emily didn't argue. "No," she replied calmly. "It happened because of choices. Yours, mine, all of them." Richard swallowed. "I lost everything. If you have a one-stove." Emily met his eyes, not unkindly. "You lost control." That was the truth. After the meeting, Emily walked out into the afternoon air with Daniel beside her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He already knew she was. They stopped at a cafe. Daniel held Noah while Emily ordered. It was an ordinary moment. Coffee cups, soft music, a baby sleeping against a steady chest. That ordinariness felt earned. Later that evening, Emily stood by the window of her apartment, watching the city glow as night settled in. She thought about the woman she had been: quiet, apologetic, afraid to take up space. That woman had survived. But she was no longer in charge. Emily hadn't gained revenge, or wealth, or a dramatic victory. She had gained safety, stability, a voice that didn't shake, and love that didn't demand silence. Daniel joined her by the window, close but not pressing. "You know," he said gently, "you don't owe anyone proof anymore." Emily smiled softly. "I know." She looked down at Noah, then back at the city. Richard would live with the consequences of his actions. Vanessa would rebuild or not. Emily had already moved on. She hadn't taken anything from them. She had simply stopped giving. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending of all. A year later, Emily stood in a small garden just outside the city, sunlight filtering through late spring leaves. There was no press, no spectacle, no performance. Just people who mattered. Lena adjusted the simple flowers along the aisle. Marcus stood off to the side, smiling quietly. A few friends from the nonprofit chatted softly, their laughter easy and real. Noah sat in Daniel's arms, dressed in a tiny outfit that made Emily laugh every time she looked at him. This was not the life Emily once imagined. It was better. When the music began, Emily walked forward slowly. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't wondering if she was enough. She wasn't shrinking herself to fit into someone else's expectations. Daniel waited for her with the same calm presence that had carried her through the hardest moments of her life. Not a savior, not a hero, just a man who stayed. When they exchanged vows, Daniel spoke first. "I promise you safety," he said. "Not control, not perfection. Safety." Emily felt tears rise, but she didn't fight them. "I promise you truth," she replied, "even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then." They didn't promise forever in dramatic terms. They promised effort, respect, listening, choosing each other again and again. That was enough. Afterward, as people hugged her and congratulated her, Emily watched Noah toddle unsteadily across the grass toward her. Daniel followed close behind, ready but not rushing. That image stayed with her. Years ago, Richard had believed power meant ownership, that love meant obedience, that silence meant loyalty. He had been wrong about all of it. Emily's life now was quieter. Mornings started with breakfast messes and soft music. Workdays were full but purposeful. Evenings ended with books, laughter, and a sense of peace she once thought was unrealistic. Richard remained in the background, present only where required, distant where it counted. He followed the rules because he had no choice. The anger had faded, replaced by something resigned. Vanessa never resurfaced in their lives. Emily didn't wonder about either of them anymore. She had learned something essential. Closure doesn't come from watching someone else fall. It comes from building something that no longer includes them. One night, long after the wedding guests had gone home, Emily sat on the couch with Daniel beside her, Noah asleep between them. The apartment was quiet, filled with the kind of stillness that felt earned. "Do you ever think about how close you came to staying?" Daniel asked gently. Emily nodded. "Sometimes." "And?" he asked. She smiled, looking down at her son, then back at the man beside her. "I'm glad I left," she said, "because if I hadn't, I would have taught him the wrong lessons." Daniel kissed her forehead. Outside, the city hummed softly, indifferent and vast. Inside, Emily felt grounded. Her story hadn't ended with revenge. It ended with choice. She chose safety over status, truth over appearance, love over fear. And the child who once carried another man's name as a symbol of protection now carried it as a promise fulfilled. This was her ending. Not perfect, but honest. And finally, completely her own. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us at this moment, then maybe, just maybe, something in this journey touched your heart in a quiet but meaningful way. What Emily's story reminds us is simple, yet powerful. Love should never require you to disappear. When respect is replaced by control, when silence is demanded instead of understanding, the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Healing begins the moment we stop trying to change someone who refuses to see us, and start protecting what truly matters, our dignity, our safety, and our peace. This story isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries. It's about learning, as Epictetus taught, that no one can harm you without your consent, and reclaiming that consent when life tries to take it away. Emily didn't win by destroying others. She won by building a life that no longer depended on fear. If this story spoke to you, if it mirrored something you've lived or something you're still healing from, know this. You're not weak for staying, and you're not wrong for leaving. Growth often begins where comfort ends. And before we part, if you felt something here, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach hearts that are still searching for their way forward.